What if everything you thought you knew about Meghan Markle's children was a lie? What if Archie and Lilibet, the little faces so familiar on social media, were part of a story far more shocking than anyone ever imagined? Imagine a scene. Meghan Markle, elegant and poised as always, suddenly frozen in fear. Her heart racing, her mind spinning. The cause? A single conversation with the one person she thought she could trust, her mother, Doria Ragland. In that moment, Meghan realized that the carefully constructed narrative she had spent years building could collapse in seconds. And it wasn't just her public image at stake. This went deeper. This was personal. This was family. And it had everything to do with Archie and Lilibet, the children whose very existence, their mother feared, might soon be called into question. Now, before you think this is just another rumor or tabloid exaggeration, consider the source. Doria Ragland is not someone who speaks lightly. She's deliberate. She's patient. And when she decides to reveal a truth, it is precise and calculated. The revelation she delivered to Meghan that day wasn't just a piece of gossip. It was a bombshell, one that left Meghan paralyzed with shock. But what exactly did Doria say? And why did it strike fear so profoundly into Meghan's heart? To understand, we need to start at the beginning. Or at least, the version of the story Meghan has spent years carefully curating. From the moment Archie Harrison was born, Meghan was aware of the scrutiny, the judgments, and the relentless media attention. She knew the world would watch her every move, dissect her parenting decisions, and question her every statement. Lilibet's birth only intensified that scrutiny. The stakes had never been higher. Yet, behind closed doors, Doria Ragland observed something that no one else seemed to see. Cracks in Meghan's story, inconsistencies in her explanations, moments that hinted at secrets carefully kept, secrets that would, eventually, explode into public view. And here's the shocking part. Doria had known all along. For years, she had quietly gathered pieces of information, carefully piecing together a truth that she now felt compelled to reveal. Imagine the tension in that room. Meghan, poised but anxious. Doria, calm but unwavering. The air thick with unspoken words. The conversation began innocuously enough, with casual questions about the children's routines, school schedules, and milestones. But it quickly escalated. And when Doria finally spoke the words that would forever alter Meghan's world, the effect was instantaneous. Meghan's composed facade faltered. Her mind raced. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. It's easy to forget that Meghan's life has always been public, scrutinized down to the smallest detail. Every smile, every gesture, every social media post dissected and analyzed by the press, the public, and, often, her own family. But even with that pressure, nothing could prepare her for the truth that Doria Ragland was about to expose. And it wasn't just any truth. It was the kind that could redefine how the world saw her, her children, and her family dynamics with the royal household. You might be asking yourself, what could be so devastating that Meghan, known for her composure and media savvy, would actually fear it? The answer lies in the intricate web of family, loyalty, and perception. Doria Ragland is not just Meghan's mother. She is a guardian of legacy, a keeper of truths that Meghan herself may have overlooked. And when Doria decides to speak, the words carry weight. The revelation about Archie and Lilibet wasn't just a personal disclosure. It was a statement that could ripple across the entire royal family and public consciousness. Now, here's a question for you. Why would Doria choose this exact moment to reveal such a secret? Timing, as they say, is everything. Meghan had been navigating a maze of public appearances, private meetings, and media scrutiny. Every move she made was calculated to protect her image, her children, and her relationship with the royal family. Yet, despite her careful planning, she hadn't anticipated that Doria's intervention would change everything in a single afternoon. The story starts with tension and ends with uncertainty. Imagine the scenario. Meghan, trying to maintain her usual grace, begins to realize that her carefully constructed narrative about her children is being questioned, quietly, but with undeniable authority. Doria's words were precise, targeted, and unavoidable. There was no escaping them. Meghan's reaction? Fear, disbelief, and a dawning realization that she might no longer control the story she had so meticulously shaped. And this isn't just about fear for public perception. The revelation touched on something deeper: family trust, identity, and legacy. The children Meghan adores, Archie and Lilibet, were suddenly at the center of a storm she didn't see coming. Every decision she had made, every carefully crafted story, suddenly felt vulnerable. The pressure wasn't just external. It was deeply personal. Doria Ragland had, in that moment, become the unexpected arbiter of truth, and Meghan's world shifted in an instant. Now, let's add another layer. The royal family, always attentive to public image, was already aware of tensions between Meghan and media scrutiny. But no one anticipated that a private family conversation could carry such explosive potential. Imagine the implications. If Doria's revelations became public, the narrative surrounding Meghan, Harry, and their children could unravel in ways the public had never seen before. For Meghan, it wasn't just about embarrassment. It was about control, influence, and the legacy she wanted to maintain for her children. So, what exactly did Doria reveal? While we cannot yet disclose every detail, consider this. The information challenged the very foundations of what Meghan believed to be true about Archie and Lilibet. It was the kind of revelation that makes a person pause, question, and rethink everything they thought they knew. And Meghan? She couldn't help but react, because the implications were immediate, personal, and potentially career-altering. Now, think about this from your perspective. If someone you trusted revealed something about your children that you hadn't considered, or worse, something that called into question their very reality, how would you react? Fear? Anger? Denial? Meghan experienced all of these emotions in rapid succession. The human element here is undeniable. Behind the polished public image, Meghan was human, vulnerable, and shaken to her core. But the story doesn't end with fear. It escalates. The revelation set off a chain reaction that involved private conversations, media speculation, and royal family dynamics. Social media began buzzing with rumors, insiders started whispering, and Meghan had to navigate a maze of public perception while grappling with private turmoil. Every decision mattered, every word could be scrutinized, and every move had consequences. And that's where the real tension begins. You see, in situations like these, timing, alliances, and perception are everything. Meghan's response, Doria's intentions, and the reactions of those around them would all collide in a series of events that nobody could predict. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown, a moment that would not only test family bonds, but also shake public confidence in the narratives we have come to accept about Meghan, Harry, and their children. So, why does this matter to you, the viewer? Because this isn't just a story about celebrity gossip or royal intrigue. It's a story about trust, truth, and the consequences of secrets kept too long. It's about the collision between public image and private reality, and how one revelation can change everything in an instant. And as we follow the unfolding events, you'll see just how high the stakes really are, not just for Meghan, but for her children, her family, and the legacy she hopes to leave behind. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Meghan Markle could no longer hide. You'll see why Doria Ragland holds the key to a shocking truth, one that could redefine everything we thought we knew about Archie and Lilibet. And you'll witness firsthand the moment when fear, truth, and consequence collide in a way that leaves no one untouched. It all started with a phone call Meghan never expected. A simple ring that would spiral into one of the most tense, private, and explosive family confrontations of her life. On the other end was Doria Ragland, calm, deliberate, and precise. Everything Meghan thought she had prepared for, but nothing could have readied her for the truth that was about to be revealed. Imagine the scene. Meghan sitting in her home, meticulously curated surroundings, the air of a life she had carefully constructed, the illusion of control wrapped around her like a shield. But that shield was about to crack. Doria's voice on the line wasn't casual. There was a weight, an authority, a subtle tension that immediately set Meghan on edge. And when Doria spoke, it wasn't just about polite conversation or motherly advice. It was about family. It was about secrets. It was about truths so carefully hidden that even Meghan hadn't dared to confront them herself. The first words Doria spoke were innocent enough, almost banal. Inquiries about Archie's schooling, Lilibet's milestones. But Meghan could sense something beneath the surface. A subtle undercurrent that told her this was not a routine call. Doria had never been one to mince words. Every phrase carried meaning. Every pause was deliberate. And then came the first revelation. A question so pointed, so disarmingly simple, that it immediately unmoored Meghan from her carefully controlled narrative. "You know the truth about Archie and Lilibet, don't you?" Doria asked, voice steady, almost clinical. Meghan's initial reaction was disbelief. How could her mother phrase it like a question? How could Doria suggest that she, Meghan, didn't already have full control over the story of her children's lives? But Doria wasn't asking for clarification. She was issuing a statement. And in that statement lay an unspoken accusation. The story Meghan had been telling, both publicly and privately, was incomplete. This wasn't the first time Doria had questioned Meghan's choices. But it was the first time the questions were tied so explicitly to her children. And that was what made this call so devastating. Meghan's composure, usually so polished, wavered. Her mind raced. The reality began to dawn on her. The foundation of her carefully curated life, the image of her as a devoted mother, a loving wife, a public figure in control, was not as unshakable as she had believed. Doria continued, her voice unwavering. There are things about their birth, their history, the way the story has been presented, things that are not fully truthful. You need to consider what happens if the truth ever comes out. At this point, Meghan's fear turned to panic. Her mind scrambled for solutions, explanations, and ways to regain control. But Doria was not merely revealing information. She was exposing vulnerabilities Meghan hadn't anticipated. Every decision Meghan had made, every carefully staged photo, every public appearance meant to reinforce a certain image, now seemed fragile. And for the first time, Meghan realized that her mother held information that could dismantle it all. It's crucial to understand Doria Ragland's position in all of this. Unlike Meghan, she had the advantage of distance, both emotional and geographical. She had observed, reflected, and considered long before speaking. Where Meghan acted in the moment, often reactive and defensive, Doria acted strategically, deliberately, and with purpose. Her words were not meant to provoke a confrontation. They were meant to expose a truth that could no longer be ignored. And for Meghan, that truth was nothing short of terrifying. The story of Archie and Lilibet, as Meghan had presented it, was one of love, care, and family devotion. But beneath the surface, Doria had uncovered inconsistencies. Small at first, almost imperceptible, questions about timelines, the veracity of certain public statements, the subtle ways stories had been adapted for public consumption. And yet, each detail, when taken together, formed a narrative that was fundamentally at odds with the reality Doria knew. For Meghan, the implications were immediate and personal. If any of this information reached the public, the consequences could be catastrophic, not just for her image, but for her children. Imagine a world in which the media seized upon these revelations, amplifying them, dissecting them, and questioning everything Meghan had ever presented. The thought alone was enough to trigger fear, anxiety, and an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. But there was more. Doria didn't just hint at discrepancies. She made it clear that Meghan's attempts to maintain control were limited. "You can't keep this hidden forever," she said. "People are already noticing things, and the more you try to spin the story, the worse it will get. The truth has a way of coming out, and when it does, it won't be manageable." Meghan, normally quick-witted and media-savvy, felt the weight of the warning immediately. Her mind raced through all the potential fallout, the headlines, the viral social media posts, the questions from journalists and fans alike. Every possible scenario seemed worse than the last. And in that moment, she realized that this wasn't just about a family disagreement. It was a full-blown crisis in the making, one that could escalate beyond her ability to contain it. As the conversation progressed, Doria revealed more details, each one strategically chosen to maximize impact. She spoke of inconsistencies in public statements, subtle contradictions in interviews, and private anecdotes that didn't align with Meghan's public persona. It was a meticulous dismantling of the image Meghan had carefully cultivated, and the precision of Doria's observations left Meghan speechless. There was also an emotional dimension to Doria's approach. She wasn't merely exposing facts. She was forcing Meghan to confront the moral and ethical consequences of her choices. Every statement carried an unspoken question. How much of your life is truly honest? How much of it is performance? And most importantly, what are the costs of maintaining illusions at the expense of truth? The conversation lasted far longer than Meghan anticipated. Hours passed as Doria methodically laid out evidence, observations, and warnings. Meghan's initial disbelief gave way to denial, and denial gave way to fear. By the time the call ended, she felt a mixture of dread, panic, and an urgent need to reassess everything she had taken for granted. It's at this point that the family secret becomes clear. This is not a simple tale of misinformation or misunderstanding. It is a revelation that strikes at the very core of Meghan's carefully constructed reality. The children she adores, the image she has presented to the world, and the narrative she has maintained are now in jeopardy. And at the center of it all is Doria Ragland, the one person whose words carry undeniable authority, the one person who knows the truth, and the one person Meghan cannot control. So why did Doria decide to reveal this now? Timing is everything. Meghan had been navigating a precarious path for years, balancing public appearances, private obligations, and family expectations. Every move she made was calculated to protect her image, her children, and her relationship with the royal family. Yet, despite all her efforts, Doria's revelation came at a moment when Meghan's defenses were at their weakest. The timing was strategic, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. And this is where the tension becomes almost unbearable. For Meghan, every choice from this point forward carries consequences. Every word she speaks, every public appearance, and every private interaction is filtered through the lens of this new knowledge. The story she thought she controlled is no longer hers to command. And the ripple effects extend far beyond her own life, touching the royal family, the media, and ultimately, the public. Doria's revelation isn't just a private family matter. It's a catalyst for potential upheaval. Social media, tabloids, and public opinion are already beginning to shift, picking up on subtle clues, inconsistencies, and whispers of scandal. For Meghan, the fear is not abstract. It is immediate, personal, and all-encompassing. Every moment is a balancing act between protecting her children, maintaining her public image, and navigating the fallout of a secret she no longer controls. And yet, even in the midst of this chaos, one thing is certain. Doria Ragland's words have set the stage for a confrontation, a revelation, and a reckoning that nobody could have anticipated. Meghan's carefully constructed narrative is unraveling, and the world is about to see a side of her and her family that has been hidden for far too long. By the end of this chapter, the stakes are clear. Meghan is cornered, anxious, and unprepared for what comes next. The family secret has been exposed to her. And with it, the realization that nothing will ever be the same. Archie and Lilibet, two names that the world associates with innocence, charm, and the continuation of the royal lineage. But behind closed doors, the story was far more complex, layered with secrecy, tension, and revelations that could shake the very foundation of the family Meghan thought she controlled. From the moment Doria Ragland began speaking, it became clear that these children, so beloved by the public, were at the center of a narrative far different from what anyone had been told. The chapter begins with a question that few dared to ask aloud. Are Archie and Lilibet truly who the world believes them to be? For Meghan, this wasn't merely an abstract concern. It was deeply personal, striking at the core of her identity as a mother. Every carefully staged photo, every public appearance, every narrative she had woven about her devotion to her children suddenly felt vulnerable. The very foundation of her life, the family she had built, was being questioned by the one person whose word she had always trusted. Doria Ragland's approach was methodical. She didn't rush to conclusions, didn't make accusations without evidence, and didn't allow emotion to cloud her delivery. Instead, she laid out a series of observations, each more unsettling than the last. Small inconsistencies, subtle contradictions, and unexplained details were pieced together to create a picture that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just speculation. It was a carefully constructed case, and Meghan found herself unable to counter it. Archie, the eldest, had always been portrayed as a healthy, vibrant, and happy child. Lilibet, the youngest, was depicted as the darling of public engagements, the sweet image of innocence that reinforced Meghan and Harry's carefully managed public image. But Doria hinted at anomalies, questions about timelines, discrepancies in public statements, and patterns of behavior that didn't align with the image Meghan had cultivated. Each revelation was like a small fracture in a mirror. When put together, the reflection that emerged was something Meghan could barely recognize. What made this so terrifying for Meghan wasn't just the potential public fallout. It was the private realization that her children's identities, the story she had told herself and the world, might be at risk. Doria's words forced Meghan to confront uncomfortable truths. Had she unknowingly allowed a false narrative to take root? Had she been complicit in perpetuating a story that was only partially true? The emotional weight of this revelation cannot be overstated. Imagine being a mother, fiercely protective of your children, only to have the one person whose opinion you trust most suggest that things are not as they seem. Meghan's mind raced through possibilities, probabilities, and potential responses. Panic set in, but alongside it was a gnawing realization that some truths, no matter how difficult, could not be ignored. Doria Ragland also introduced the concept of perception versus reality. In public, Archie and Lilibet were symbols of family, continuity, and innocence. But behind closed doors, the reality was more complicated. Doria's observations suggested that the public narrative had been curated to an extreme, with selective truths, omissions, and subtle fabrications carefully maintained to protect image. This revelation hit Meghan with full force. She had spent years constructing a world in which her children were celebrated, adored, and accepted, yet now she was forced to acknowledge that some of what she believed about their lives might not fully align with reality. One particularly unsettling point that Doria raised involved documentation, medical records, birth announcements, and personal correspondences. Details that Meghan assumed were consistent and straightforward were not. Tiny discrepancies, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, formed a pattern that suggested a narrative had been selectively shaped, carefully polished for public consumption. The realization was shocking. Someone had controlled the story, and for reasons Meghan did not fully understand, she had only been allowed to see a portion of it. And then there were the behavioral observations. Doria spoke of moments Meghan had likely overlooked. Archie's reactions to certain family events, Lilibet's subtle cues in social interactions, and the children's responses to media exposure. To the casual observer, these details might seem inconsequential, but when combined with the inconsistencies Doria highlighted, they painted a picture of subtle dissonance. Something about the children's world, the way it had been presented, and the way it was lived behind the scenes did not completely align. For Meghan, these revelations created a storm of emotions. Fear, of course, dominated. Fear of public humiliation, of judgment, of being exposed as someone who had lost control. But there was also guilt. Had she unknowingly participated in a narrative that was not entirely accurate? Had her desire to protect her children inadvertently contributed to a false perception? And underlying it all was the anxiety of how Harry would react once he learned that the story of their children might be more complicated than they had been led to believe. As Doria spoke, Meghan's mental state shifted rapidly. She vacillated between denial and rationalization, trying to construct a narrative in which the revelations could be dismissed or minimized. But Doria was unrelenting. Every attempt to deflect was met with careful evidence, measured questions, and reminders that the truth, once revealed, would not be easily contained. Meghan realized she could not argue her way out of this. The implications were too significant, the details too precise, and the authority of her mother too undeniable. One of the most dramatic moments of this conversation came when Doria suggested the possibility that certain assumptions Meghan had about Archie and Lilibet's history might be entirely inaccurate. She didn't provide full details at that moment. Timing and strategy mattered, but the hint alone was enough to send Meghan into a state of alarm. The fear wasn't merely about being wrong. It was about being caught in a web of public scrutiny, familial judgment, and personal guilt. Every decision from this point forward would carry weighty consequences. Now consider the human element. Meghan had spent years navigating a life under constant observation, balancing her public persona with private responsibilities. The revelation that her children's lives, or at least the narrative surrounding them, might not fully reflect reality was destabilizing. It wasn't just information. It was a seismic shift in perception, one that could influence relationships, public trust, and Meghan's own sense of identity as a mother and a public figure. Doria's revelations also touched on timing. Certain events, anniversaries, and milestones were mentioned not as casual observations, but as markers of inconsistency. Doria wanted Meghan to understand that patterns, when analyzed over time, revealed truths that could no longer be ignored. Every carefully curated social media post, every staged public appearance, every official statement, when placed in context, contributed to a narrative that was incomplete, and Meghan had unknowingly been at the center of it, both as participant and guardian. By the end of their conversation, Meghan was left with a chilling realization. The world she had controlled, the story she had believed in, and the image she had carefully managed for years were all vulnerable. The untold story of Archie and Lilibet was no longer just a private family matter. It was a puzzle that, once exposed, could redefine public perception, influence media narratives, and challenge the foundations of trust within the family. And yet, the most shocking detail had not yet been revealed. Doria had hinted, strategically and deliberately, that there was more, much more, that Meghan did not yet know. Something that, once disclosed, would escalate the tension to unprecedented levels. For Meghan, this wasn't just about fear anymore. It was about confronting a truth so significant that it threatened to upend the life she had built around her children. The story of Archie and Lilibet, the untold story, is a narrative that goes beyond ordinary family secrets. It is a tale of perception versus reality, of curated images versus lived experience, and of the ways in which truth, no matter how deeply hidden, has a way of surfacing. For Meghan Markle, the realization that her children's narrative might be at odds with reality marked the beginning of a crisis that would reverberate far beyond the walls of her home and eventually across the globe. You've seen Meghan Markle composed, polished, confident, the woman who steps into a room and commands attention. But what happens when that composure cracks? What happens when a truth hits so hard, so unexpectedly, that the carefully curated mask of control shatters in an instant? That's what happened the moment Doria Ragland's revelations about Archie and Lilibet sank in. Imagine her in that room, or on that call, the atmosphere heavy, the air thick with tension. Meghan had spent years navigating public life with precision, every movement calculated, every word rehearsed. She knew the eyes of the world were on her, ready to dissect, judge, and amplify every misstep. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared her for the avalanche of fear, confusion, and disbelief triggered by her mother's words. Panic doesn't always roar. Sometimes it creeps. It begins as a flutter in the chest, a knot in the stomach, a racing of thoughts so rapid that clarity vanishes. For Meghan, it started with disbelief. Could Doria really be revealing what she thought she already knew? Or worse, implying that Meghan herself had been living in partial ignorance? That thought alone was enough to make her heart pound, her hands tremble, and her carefully maintained facade begin to falter. The first reaction was denial. Meghan attempted to rationalize, to dismiss, to frame Doria's words as overly cautious or exaggerated. After all, how could the story of Archie and Lilibet, the children she had nurtured, loved, and fiercely protected, be anything but what she had always believed? Yet every attempt to convince herself was met with the undeniable weight of her mother's evidence, carefully presented, meticulously detailed, impossible to ignore. Fear followed closely behind. Not just fear of public scrutiny, although that was part of it, but fear for her children, for her reputation, and for the fragile web of control she had spent years maintaining. Panic is often a combination of past regrets and future anxieties. Meghan felt both acutely. Every decision she had made, every interview, every statement, every Instagram post suddenly felt vulnerable. What if something she thought was private was already compromised? What if Doria's revelations weren't confined to that phone call? It didn't help that Meghan's life has always been under a microscope. She has lived with the constant hum of public opinion, media speculation, and paparazzi intrusion. Every smile, every gesture, every word dissected. And yet, this was different. This was private, intimate, and deeply personal. The panic was not merely about how the world would perceive her. It was about the fundamental truth of her children's lives, and whether she could protect them from being misrepresented or misunderstood. The symptoms of panic were immediate and physical. Meghan's pulse quickened, her thoughts became a whirlwind, and the room around her seemed to constrict. Panic can manifest in subtle ways. A sharp intake of breath, a sudden tension in the shoulders, a tightening in the chest. For Meghan, it was a combination of all these and more. Her mind raced through possibilities, worst-case scenarios, and potential damage control strategies. But the more she tried to regain composure, the more elusive it became. And yet, panic is not always irrational. It's often a signal, a survival mechanism that alerts us to threats we may not have consciously recognized. For Meghan, the panic was a warning. The narrative she had carefully crafted, the image she had meticulously maintained, and the story of her children that she had controlled, were all under threat. The fear wasn't paranoia. It was real, justified, and immediate. The next stage was frantic strategizing. Meghan considered her options: how to contain the information, how to address her mother, how to manage Harry's reaction, how to anticipate public perception. Each thought spiraled into another, a cascade of possibilities and contingencies. Panic doesn't allow for calm deliberation. It forces urgency. And Meghan felt that urgency keenly. She knew that if she did not act quickly, the fallout could be devastating. But panic is also isolating. Even someone with Meghan's confidence can feel profoundly alone in moments like this. She couldn't share the details with Harry just yet, couldn't confide in friends, and certainly couldn't predict how the media would react if whispers began to leak. It's a lonely, suffocating experience. To know the stakes are enormous, the consequences severe, and the information so delicate that a single misstep could spiral into catastrophe. Humor, irony, or distraction often failed during panic. Meghan couldn't laugh this off. She couldn't dismiss it as trivial. Every attempt to do so only magnified the weight of the revelation. Her usual tactics, controlled messaging, careful scheduling, image management, suddenly felt inadequate. She was, for the first time in years, genuinely unprepared for the emotional and logistical storm she faced. And then came the physical manifestations. Panic has a way of seizing control over the body. Meghan felt a flush of heat, a cold sweat, and the unmistakable flutter of nausea that accompanies overwhelming fear. Her thoughts tumbled faster than she could organize them, looping endlessly over what-ifs and should-haves. The mind of someone in panic is like a stormy sea, each wave crashing over the other with relentless force. For Meghan, every memory, every detail about Archie and Lilibet, every past decision she had made suddenly collided, creating a tumult she could barely navigate. It's important to understand the emotional dimensions of Meghan's panic. Beyond fear and anxiety lay guilt, shame, and a sense of betrayal. Guilt for perhaps not noticing the discrepancies Doria highlighted earlier. Shame for the possibility of public exposure. And a profound sense of betrayal, not necessarily by anyone malicious, but by the reality that her understanding of her children's lives might have been incomplete. Panic, in this context, is a complex emotion, a mixture of self-preservation, regret, and protective instinct. As the conversation with Doria progressed, Meghan's panic intensified. Her reactions became more immediate and visible. Short, sharp sentences, stammering, pauses as she struggled to comprehend the implications, and sudden bursts of defensiveness. Panic is unpredictable, and for Meghan, it manifested as a combination of fight, flight, and freeze responses. She wanted to argue, to deny, to deflect. But the weight of evidence, precision of Doria's observations, and the moral clarity in her mother's voice left her unable to fully counter. Socially and psychologically, panic often triggers both inward and outward effects. Meghan felt the inward weight, the racing heart, the spiraling thoughts, the sense of being trapped. Externally, it affected her interactions, her composure, and her ability to strategize effectively. Every public appearance, every private conversation, Every moment after that call would be colored by this newfound vulnerability. And Meghan knew it. She was acutely aware that she could no longer operate as though she was fully in control. This is where the stakes escalate. Panic is not merely an emotional reaction. It's a signal that circumstances have shifted. Meghan's panic was a clear indicator that the family dynamics, the narratives around her children, and her ability to maintain the carefully curated public image were all under threat. Every step she took from this point forward would be influenced, constrained, and scrutinized, not just by the public, but by those who knew the truth. The most harrowing realization came when Meghan recognized that her mother held information that could fundamentally alter public perception. Doria's revelations weren't just private observations. They were evidence, subtle but undeniable, of a story Meghan could no longer fully control. Panic isn't merely a fear of immediate danger. It's the fear of the cascade that follows, the series of events triggered by a single revelation that cannot be undone. For Meghan, that cascade was already underway. And yet, panic, as debilitating as it can be, also forces clarity. In the midst of fear, Meghan had to confront decisions she had been avoiding, truths she had been unwilling to face, and a reality that demanded acknowledgement. This is the paradox. Panic immobilizes, yet it compels action. Meghan's mind, though racing and panicked, was forced into strategic consideration. Every choice, every word, every appearance had to be reconsidered in light of the new truth. By the end of this chapter, the full weight of Meghan's panic is undeniable. It is not a fleeting emotion, but a transformative force that reshapes her perception of control, family, and public image. The children she cherishes, the narrative she has defended, and the image she projects to the world are all vulnerable. Meghan's panic is both emotional and strategic, a recognition that nothing will ever be the same, and a prelude to the confrontations, revelations, and upheavals yet to come. The palace was abuzz long before Meghan even realized the storm had reached its doors. In the world of royalty, every subtle shift, every whispered rumor, and every sudden tension is felt instantly. Nothing remains private for long. When Doria Ragland's revelations about Archie and Lilibet began to ripple outward, the royal family reacted with a mixture of calculated concern, disbelief, and quiet alarm. This wasn't just another headline. This was a private, explosive truth colliding with centuries of protocol, expectation, and public perception. It started in the corridors of Buckingham Palace, where aides, advisors, and senior staff noticed subtle changes in communications. Messages sent, calls received, and meetings convened suddenly carried a heavier undertone. Charles, already deeply involved in family affairs, sensed the shift before most. To him, nothing happens by accident in the royal household, and the tension surrounding Meghan and Harry's family was palpable. For years, he had tried to manage relationships, public perception, and personal dynamics, but even he could sense that this was different. William, ever protective of the family legacy and conscious of public image, was next to notice the disturbance. He understood instinctively that Meghan's private panic was no longer just a personal matter. It was a potential public crisis. Every member of the family knew that the children, Archie and Lilibet, were central to the story, not only for Meghan and Harry, but for the royal narrative as a whole. Any revelation questioning the story of their upbringing, identity, or family circumstances could ignite unprecedented media scrutiny. The reaction was layered. On one level, there was the calm, formal handling expected of royals. Meetings were called, statements reviewed, and contingency plans discussed. On another level, the emotional dimension could not be hidden. Frustration, anxiety, and a growing sense of urgency ran beneath the polished surface. Meghan's panic was no longer confined to her own household. It had reached the inner circle of the monarchy, prompting questions, fears, and calculated observations. The first major point of tension came when the family realized that Doria Ragland's revelation could not be contained. This was not a rumor or a fleeting anecdote. It was a carefully considered disclosure with concrete implications. Charles and William understood that if details about Archie and Lilibet's histories, or inconsistencies in the narratives Meghan had presented, were made public, it could trigger a media storm of unprecedented scale. Every decision made in that moment had to balance protecting the family, mitigating potential scandal, and maintaining loyalty. In private conversations, the nuances became clear. Charles, aware of the stakes, emphasized caution and discretion. He knew the public was already sensitive to any perceived missteps by Meghan and Harry, and any additional controversy could not only damage reputations, but also undermine public trust in the monarchy itself. William, equally vigilant, weighed the implications for succession, public opinion, and the emotional well-being of family members. Together, their private strategizing revealed a complex web of considerations: public image, family loyalty, and the emerging chaos surrounding Meghan's household. The palace staff, too, were acutely aware of the brewing tension. Courtiers, aides, and security personnel began to note subtle shifts in Meghan's behavior. Hurried schedules, late-night communications, and private meetings that seemed to carry extra weight. They understood instinctively that Meghan's private panic could become a matter of public consequence, and their concern was not idle. In the royal household, perception is reality, and every minor disruption has the potential to escalate into headline news. At the heart of this reaction was a profound sense of uncertainty. No one could predict how Meghan would respond to Doria's revelations, or how Harry would handle the fallout. Both were fiercely protective of their children, but both were now operating under the shadow of incomplete information and escalating pressure. In a family that prizes discretion, loyalty, and tradition, the tension was palpable. Every conversation, every meeting, every glance carried weight far beyond its immediate context. One particularly telling incident occurred during a routine family briefing. An aide mentioned subtle discrepancies in public statements about Archie and Lilibet's routines. The room went silent. Charles and William exchanged meaningful glances, understanding the implications immediately. These small inconsistencies, when placed within the broader context of Doria's revelations, suggested that Meghan's carefully curated story might be vulnerable. Panic had spread beyond her private sphere. It was now a matter of palace concern. The family's reaction was not uniform. Some members expressed disbelief, questioning whether the revelations could possibly be true. Others, more attuned to nuance, recognized the gravity of the situation immediately. Conversations were carefully measured, statements cautiously framed, and plans devised for potential public exposure. The royal family had weathered scandals before, but this situation was unprecedented. A private family revelation with the potential to ripple outward into public, legal, and emotional domains. Social media, though not officially monitored in the palace, added another layer of tension. Early signs of speculation, subtle shifts in public discourse, and the potential for leaks were already being noticed. Charles and William were acutely aware that the court of public opinion moves fast and can amplify even the smallest inconsistencies into full-blown crises. Meghan's panic, previously a private matter, now had consequences that extended far beyond her own household. The emotional dynamics were equally complex. Charles, balancing his role as monarch with the expectations of fatherhood and grandfatherhood, felt the dual weight of public duty and private concern. William, protective of the family legacy, was sensitive to the delicate balance between loyalty and perception. The entire family sensed that the situation required immediate action. But any action, if misjudged, could worsen the fallout. Panic, tension, and uncertainty had now migrated from Meghan's private sphere into the very heart of the royal family. Doria Ragland, of course, remained an unpredictable factor. Her careful timing and deliberate strategy meant that the royal family could not easily anticipate her next move. She held information that could destabilize carefully constructed narratives, challenge assumptions, and provoke unprecedented public interest. For the family, this meant that Meghan's panic was only the beginning. The real test was how the family would respond to both her reactions and the looming potential for public exposure. In the days that followed, private discussions intensified. Advisors, counselors, and senior staff reviewed communications, planned contingencies, and considered the long-term implications for Meghan, Harry, Archie, and Lilibet. Every detail mattered. Timing of public appearances, choice of words in interviews, and even the subtle management of social media. For the royal family, This was more than a private issue. It was a potential crisis that could redefine public perception, media narratives, and familial loyalty. But amidst all this, there was also an emotional reality that could not be ignored. Royals are trained in discretion, diplomacy, and presentation, but they are also human. Charles, William, and others felt genuine concern for Meghan and her children. They understood that the revelations posed not just reputational risks, but emotional challenges. The panic that had gripped Meghan was understandable. It was a natural reaction to an unprecedented situation. And yet, the stakes remained high. One misstep, one poorly judged response, and the consequences could extend far beyond private family dynamics into the public sphere. By the end of this chapter, the royal family had fully grasped the gravity of the situation. Meghan's panic was no longer confined to her private world. It had infiltrated the palace, the advisors, and the broader network of relationships surrounding her. The revelations about Archie and Lilibet, coupled with Doria Ragland's calculated timing, had set off a chain reaction that threatened both private trust and public perception. The family was now forced to navigate a delicate, high-stakes landscape where every word, gesture, and decision mattered. And yet, the most dramatic moment was still to come. The tension, though palpable, was only the beginning. The next revelation, one that would shock not only Meghan but the entire royal family, was looming just beyond the horizon. The moment Meghan's private panic collided with public curiosity, social media erupted like a powder keg. Platforms that never sleep lit up with speculation, gossip, and outright frenzy. From Instagram to Twitter, every detail of Meghan and Harry's lives, and now, more critically, their children Archie and Lilibet, was being analyzed, dissected, and debated by millions. The palace, long accustomed to controlling narratives through careful statements and vetted appearances, suddenly found itself facing an unstoppable, chaotic force. It began subtly at first. An insider post here, a cryptic comment there. Observers noticed discrepancies in photos, differences in timelines, and little hints that seemed unusual. To the casual scroll, these might have been meaningless, but in the context of Doria Ragland's revelations, they became fuel for speculation. Social media users, eager for drama and armed with sharp eyes, began connecting dots, asking questions, and forming theories. The panic that had gripped Meghan in private was now visible on a global stage. Memes spread almost immediately, some humorous, others cutting, all hinting at a hidden story. Hashtags emerged, quietly at first. Hashtag Archie Mystery, hashtag Lilibet Truth, hashtag Markle Secrets. Within hours, the hashtags were trending worldwide. Influencers, reporters, and everyday users amplified the chatter, creating a feedback loop that pushed the story into mainstream consciousness. Social media is relentless, and now Meghan's panic was no longer confined to her living room. It was magnified, dissected, and broadcasted to millions. The speed of online reaction was staggering. One post questioning the timeline of Archie's early milestones was enough to spark dozens of threads analyzing every interview Meghan had given, every public appearance of the children, and even subtle facial expressions captured in photographs. Each thread spiraled into sub-theories, fueled by speculation, confirmation bias, and the human fascination with scandal. The private revelation had become a global spectacle, and Meghan's anxiety levels, already sky-high, were about to reach unprecedented heights. But social media didn't stop at observation. It escalated. Accounts claiming insider knowledge, some credible and others clearly fabricated, began to leak information suggesting inconsistencies in Archie and Lilibet's narratives. Video clips, juxtaposed with old interviews, were circulated widely. Users debated, argued, and even mocked, all contributing to a chaotic digital storm. For Meghan, the panic she had felt in private suddenly had a public echo, reverberating through platforms she could not control. This is where the stakes became tangible. Unlike traditional media, social media thrives on speed, immediacy, and virality. Facts, half-truths, and outright fabrications blended together seamlessly, creating an environment where perception became reality. Every post, every comment, every share reinforced the narrative of uncertainty surrounding Archie and Lilibet. The carefully constructed story Meghan had maintained was now under assault by millions of eyes, and her ability to manage the situation was nearly non-existent. Influencers and journalists amplified the panic further. Podcasts and YouTube channels dissected images and statements, comparing timelines and pointing out alleged inconsistencies. Fan accounts, once celebratory, now became speculative, questioning Meghan's credibility and the authenticity of her children's narrative. The ripple effect was unstoppable, and the digital sphere became a battleground where every argument, every post, and every comment contributed to the mounting tension. The royal household quickly recognized the danger. Advisors scrambled to monitor trends, identify sources of misinformation, and control damage. Statements were drafted, press briefings considered, and social media strategies devised. But in the age of instant information, controlling the narrative was nearly impossible. Every second mattered. Every post mattered. And Meghan, already panicked, had to contend not only with her mother's revelations, but with the relentless public scrutiny amplifying every doubt. The psychological impact on Meghan was immediate. Panic, already simmering, intensified in the face of public scrutiny. The human mind reacts to threat in predictable ways: fight, flight, or freeze. For Meghan, the initial panic that had been private transformed into a complex mix of strategic anxiety and emotional overwhelm. Each new post, comment, or share acted as a trigger, reinforcing fear and heightening stress. Her body, already primed for anxiety, responded with increased heart rate, tension, and the kind of dread that only a public collapse can generate. Social media also magnified the emotional stakes. Friends, acquaintances, and distant relatives, previously neutral observers, now weighed in publicly, offering opinions that ranged from supportive to critical. Celebrities, pundits, and journalists joined the conversation, further intensifying the global spotlight. Every mention of Meghan, Harry, or the children became a point of analysis, a chance for speculation, or a new narrative twist. Panic was no longer an internal emotional state. It had externalized, spreading across millions of digital platforms and millions of observers. And then came the viral moment that shifted the story into overdrive. A video clip surfaced, allegedly showing Meghan responding to questioning about Archie and Lilibet, that was dissected frame by frame. Users debated every nuance: her tone, facial expressions, gestures, and timing. The online audience, empowered by social media's reach, began interpreting her panic as confirmation of hidden truths. Whether accurate or not, perception was now the dominant reality. Meghan's private anxiety had become public fodder, and the consequences were irreversible. The social media explosion also forced strategic considerations. Advisors urged Meghan to respond, to clarify, to assert control. But any action risked further amplification. Silence could be interpreted as guilt. Response could be spun as defensiveness. Social media operates on a feedback loop. Every post generates another. Every reaction inspires more analysis, and every silence fuels speculation. Meghan was trapped in a digital storm that offered no safe harbor. What made this even more dramatic was the timing. Social media doesn't wait for official statements, carefully worded clarifications, or private negotiations. It thrives on immediacy. By the time Meghan even considered a measured response, the story had evolved, splintered into sub-narratives, and taken on a life of its own. The panic she felt privately had now become a performance in the digital arena, observed, analyzed, and critiqued by millions worldwide. Emotional spikes followed. Panic gave way to frustration, frustration to desperation, and desperation to strategic calculation. Meghan had to navigate not only the revelations from Doria Ragland, but also the relentless, unpredictable amplification of social media. Every decision carried enormous weight. One misstep could be magnified, one word twisted, and one gesture misinterpreted. The stakes were both intensely personal and publicly enormous. The ripple effects didn't stop at Meghan. Harry, previously in protective mode, was now pulled into the maelstrom. His own responses were dissected, his social media activity scrutinized, and his public appearances reinterpreted through the lens of the growing narrative about Archie and Lilibet. The panic that started as a private moment had expanded exponentially, affecting the entire family, their advisors, and the global audience that consumed every detail. By the end of this chapter, the power of social media had become undeniable. The platform that amplifies voices, spreads information, and connects millions had transformed Meghan's private panic into a global spectacle. The revelations about Archie and Lilibet, combined with Doria Ragland's precise timing and the instantaneous amplification of digital platforms, had created a perfect storm. Public perception, media narratives, and private family tension were now intertwined in ways that threatened control at every level. And yet, amidst all this chaos, one more revelation loomed. A truth so shocking that it would escalate the crisis even further, pushing Meghan, Harry, and the royal family toward an emotional and public breaking point. The moment had arrived. Meghan could no longer avoid it, ignore it, or control it from behind the screens, statements, and social media spins. The private confrontation with Doria Ragland, the one conversation that had started in a simple, calculated tone, was now inevitable, unavoidable, and charged with emotion. This wasn't just a conversation about facts, dates, or timelines. This was about trust, control, and the unspoken truths that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. It began innocuously. Doria arrived at Meghan's residence under the guise of a casual visit, her composure and calm demeanor belying the storm of revelations she carried. Meghan, still reeling from social media chaos and palace scrutiny, tried to maintain her composure. She greeted her mother politely, a smile on her face, but underneath that practiced exterior, fear and tension surged. Every word, every gesture, was now laden with significance. Doria, as always, was deliberate. She didn't rush, didn't rely on emotion, and didn't dramatize. Instead, she positioned herself strategically, both physically and psychologically, forcing Meghan to confront the reality she had been trying to manage. Every phrase was measured, every question carefully designed to elicit not just responses, but emotional accountability. It was not an interrogation, but it carried the weight of one. The conversation started with small talk, an almost perfunctory attempt to calm the atmosphere. But it wasn't long before Doria pivoted toward the issue at hand. Her first words hit Meghan like a thunderclap. "We need to talk about Archie and Lilibet, about the truth you've been telling yourself, and the truth you've been telling the world." Meghan's immediate reaction was shock. Her mind raced to formulate a response, but the words faltered. She had prepared for media scrutiny, for social criticism, and for public speculation, but not for this. Doria's tone carried authority, clarity, and moral gravity. There was no room for evasion, no way to spin, and no space to control the narrative. The confrontation was private, but the stakes were immeasurably high. Doria began to unpack her observations, starting with the most subtle inconsistencies. She spoke of timelines, public statements, and private anecdotes that didn't align with Meghan's narrative. Each revelation was layered carefully, designed not to humiliate, but to expose patterns and force acknowledgement of the truth. Meghan, initially defensive, found herself increasingly cornered. Every rebuttal she tried was met with precision, leaving her no room for misdirection or rationalization. The emotional intensity escalated quickly. Meghan's fear, previously simmering, erupted into panic. Her voice trembled, gestures became more animated, and her composure, always a protective shield, cracked under the weight of reality. Doria remained calm, almost unnervingly so, and the contrast heightened Meghan's vulnerability. Panic is contagious in emotional confrontations, and in this private setting, Meghan's internal chaos became palpable, tangible. Doria's next move was deliberate, and it hit at the core of Meghan's motherly identity. She raised questions about the children's public narratives, the photos, the media appearances, and the carefully curated stories. "Do you think the world will understand the real Archie and Lilibet if these inconsistencies come out?" she asked, voice measured, eyes steady. It was a direct challenge, less about accusation, more about accountability. Meghan's mind reeled. Every strategic plan she had devised, every media message she had crafted, now seemed insufficient. The confrontation wasn't just about facts, it was about trust and responsibility. Doria emphasized the importance of honesty, of integrity, and of protecting the children's well-being above all else. "What you do now," she said, "will shape how Archie and Lilibet see the world, how they trust you, and how they understand themselves. You cannot undo that." Meghan's panic intensified. She realized that her choices, previously framed as protective, could now be interpreted as manipulative, deceptive, or self-serving. The emotional stakes were enormous. This confrontation also forced Meghan to confront her own fears. The thought of public exposure, media ridicule, and palace scrutiny collided with her maternal instincts. Panic, anxiety, and dread became intertwined with guilt and shame. She had wanted to protect her children, to control their narrative, and to maintain a sense of security. But the private confrontation revealed that her protective strategies may have inadvertently contributed to the very vulnerabilities she feared. Tension escalated when Doria revealed additional details. Not just inconsistencies, but potential consequences, how the information could be interpreted, how public perception could shift, and how relationships with Harry and the royal family could be impacted. Each revelation was like a psychological scalpel, cutting through Meghan's defenses and exposing raw fear beneath. The confrontation was no longer hypothetical. It was immediate, urgent, and emotionally overwhelming. Meghan's panic reached a peak as Doria outlined the long-term stakes. "If this isn't addressed now, it won't just affect you. It will affect the children, the family, and the public perception of everyone involved. You need to decide how to proceed. Not tomorrow, not next week, but right now." The words were not threatening. They were precise, deliberate, and morally weighted. Meghan felt the crushing realization that the time for evasion had passed. She was cornered, forced to confront both her own panic and the far-reaching consequences of hidden truths. Throughout the confrontation, Meghan oscillated between fear, defensiveness, and desperation. Panic clouded her judgment, but it also clarified what mattered most: the children. Every argument she made, every tear she shed, was tied to protecting Archie and Lilibet. Doria, aware of this, guided the conversation toward solutions, emphasizing transparency, honesty, and measured action. The confrontation was as much about strategy as it was about accountability. The private confrontation also revealed the emotional depth of their relationship. Despite fear, tension,